Will you drink to the earth and to the days which have passed upon it? Will you drink to the fullness which was and to friends who have passed on?
Are you shocked by how you are being treated by the Democrats and their media?
I'm not happy about it, but I'm not shocked. I know, people get subsumed in orthodoxies. I believe that the values that I am trying to promote are the exact values that my father and my uncle would have promoted. And I've, written books about my family. I've studied them. I have, the more that I've studied my family, the more I've written and researched them, my uncle and my father, the more proud I am of them. And I have devoted my life to promoting the same kind of values that I think they promoted. And I'm trying to, one of my purposes in running is to remind the Democratic Party of, what we are supposed to represent and what we've always represented. And, people have said to me, why don't you run as an independent? And I say, because I'm a Democrat. This is who I am. This is my identity, but I want my party back. I want my party to be the party that I grew up in, the party of John Kennedy, the party of Robert Kennedy, the party of FDR, and Harry Truman.
The Democratic Party, which has historically been the party that represented labor, made a shift, and RFK Jr. has talked about this, but made a shift in the 70s and 80s toward taking more corporate money, which had historically been the province of Republican politicians, and started to have more conservative economic policies as a consequence of that. So now you have two economically conservative parties that distinguish themselves solely on the basis of how they react to cultural issues. And so we've had a ratcheting up of the division around those cultural issues, taking relatively small populations like trans kids, of which there are only a few thousand, and making them a national case so that no one is paying attention to the fact that their bank accounts are getting smaller, their dollar goes less far than it did before, the price of housing has ballooned, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think there is some real legitimate nostalgia for yesteryear. I don't think it's necessarily that productive to just generally cast back into the past and say, well, it was better that back then, without talking about the fact that the tax rate for the rich was much higher. Corporate tax rate was much higher. We had much more robust funding to social programs, et cetera. There's a reason why things were better back then for the average American. But I do think he's very right to tap into the feeling, and again, not for all Americans, of course, but to the feeling that economically our policies were much more populist in the past.
We want to play the next clip here. Moderator Elizabeth Vargas pressed Kennedy on the support he's receiving from major figures on the right, including Steve Bannon. Here's how he responded.
My father was able to harness these populist energies. In the last day of his life, he won the most rural state in this country, South Dakota, and the most urban. He was able to bridge the divide among people who would otherwise be Republican, but wanted somebody who was common sense, who was able to appeal to their idealism, who was able to find the hero in each of them, who was able to get them to transcend narrow self-interest and see themselves as part of a community and part of this, incredible American adventure in modeling self-governance for the rest of the world. And so I'm proud that President Trump likes me, even though I don't agree with him on most of his issues, because I don't want to alienate people. I want to bring people together. I'm proud that all these people like me and that I have independent supporters and Democratic supporters, and that I'm able to bring a lot of people. Every Democrat says, I want to end the polarization. But how do you do that without talking to people who don't agree with you? How do you do that without appealing to people? My purpose is to find the issues, the values that we have in common.
Yeah, listen to how easy that is. I'm glad that Trump likes me, even though I disagree with him. You've established that you have basically an endorsement from someone who's very popular without tying yourself to any of his policy commitments and without disrespecting any of the people that like him. Now, contrast that with what some of the players in the Republican field have been struggling with. They often will perhaps go too far in validating aspects of his agenda that actually aren't that politically popular and which are somewhat toxic. They will be obsequious and praise things that are not really policy related and don't need to be praised in a way that undermines their own credibility, especially now that they're running against him and doing a real heel turn the way that Chris Christie has on his views about Donald Trump. It is possible to come up with a response that respects the audience without diminishing your own integrity. And I think we just saw a really fantastic example of how to model a response to what do you do when someone who you don't likes you back. He just simply didn't opine on his substantive feelings about Trump as a man out of respect, I believe, for an audience, many of whom like Trump, and instead said, look, we disagree on substantive policy issues. I don't agree with him, but it is a good thing that even someone like him sees the value in somebody like me.
At this point in history, in the last 3 years in this country, we've seen an all-out assault on our Bill of Rights. We've seen for the first time the government participating in censoring people's speech. There was, these revelations came out this week that the FBI has been collaborating with the SBU, the Ukrainian agency, to censor speech of Americans critical of U.S. policy against the Ukraine. We've seen the CIA and the FBI now had during at least the last 2 administrations, at portals at Twitter where they could identify people who were speaking against government policies and silence them. And so we had these assaults on freedom of speech. We had the government come in and order, without any scientific citation, without any democratic process, the closure of every church in this country for a year. We had an assault on freedom of religion. We had an assault with we had these social distancing regulations and policies that again, were not based upon, we now know, and Rachel Walensky and Anthony Fauci have acknowledged, they were not based on science. There was no democratic process. There was no public hearings. There was no notice and comment rulemaking. No scientific citation shown to any of us. And yet that was a direct assault on our right to assembly. We had every business, 3.3 million businesses in this country, closed down in violation of the Fifth Amendment right to due process and just compensation. None of them were given due process or just compensation. We had the Seventh Amendment jury trial shut down against anybody who was providing a medical countermeasure, no matter how egregious your injury, no matter how reckless or negligent their behavior, you can't sue them. And that's a violation of the Seventh Amendment. So there's a lot of people in this country who are watching this happen and say our entire Constitution is under attack. And the only provision that was not under attack is the Second Amendment. And a lot of the people who believe strongly about guns say, well, the reason they didn't attack the Second Amendment is because we have our guns. Now, whether you believe that or not, and I'm not going to take a position on that one way or the other, but going after people's guns at this point in history, to me, is just going to cause more polarization and make it so that we can't listen to each other anymore, because we get put into these kind of tribal silos which we have to somehow figure out a way to get past. My policy is going to be to figure out ways to protect these children. We cannot have any more school shootings. And, one of the things, even if that means protecting schools the same way that we protect airlines, you don't get shootings on airlines anymore. If we have to do that, we have to protect our children. The other thing we need to look at is the other reasons why this may be happening in our country. And, I've gotten ridiculed for saying that we need to look at the issue of the SSRIs. But it's one of the issues we need to look at. We need to look at video games. We need to look at the way that social media is affecting people's behaviors, and do the scientific studies that are required for that. There has never been a time in human history when strangers would walk into a room of children and begin shooting people. What happened? We had guns when I was a kid. I went to school where we had a gun club in the school, and kids would come with their rifles to school. And nobody even imagined that somebody would go in that school and start shooting children. There's other countries that have almost as many guns as we do, like Switzerland, that don't have school shootings. So what is going on here? The last school shooting in Switzerland was 21 years ago. We have school shootings every 21 hours. One of the things we need to look at are SSRIs. There is one study that shows that at least 23% of school shootings have that the shooter was at the time or prior or before was on SSRIs. So, and if you look at the label, manufacturing the insert for these drugs, they say on them homicidal and suicidal ideation and action. So it's not insane to say we should look at this. Something changed in our country that started this. And it's not the guns. Because we've always had the guns. Something else happened, and we need to be looking, and that's the function of NIH. This is the biggest health threat in our country, these shootings. NIH is supposed to be doing science that actually looks at the cause. The problem is it doesn't want to do anything that will offend the pharmaceutical industry. So they will not even do a genuine study, and it's hard for the public or the press to figure it out because of the HIPAA laws. You can't get that information on these shooters. But NIH can get the information, but it won't do it because it does not want to offend the pharmaceutical companies, and we ought to at least be looking at that.